So some of you may be aware from some of the notices and articles that Alex has put up on the website and emails that he sent out that we recently did a pretty thorough, complete rewrite of the Coverage Addendum to the Ucip governing documents. And just wanted to go through with you today the changes that we've made to the document, and review also some of the new and changed coverages that we made as we went through that process of updating the document itself. So on the next slide.
There we go.
I just wanted to go over quickly our process that we use when we make changes to the coverage document. And the primary thing that we look at when we consider making a change to the coverage document is what the member needs are. And I know that some of you on the call have been a part of that process. You know, I think of Charlene and Joelle and Mary, and things that you've had questions. We've talked about the coverage that's available. You've expressed some concerns with the coverage or lack thereof that Ucip had. And at that point, I go back and go through this process to see if we can expand or create additional coverage to meet the needs of the membership. One that we just recently did, Davis County was going to look at having a veterinarian on staff, and our coverage agreement excluded veterinarians for liability. But when Davis County expressed that concern, we went through this process and actually ended up adding coverage for veterinarians under the coverage agreement. So that's our first step in the process, is when we identify a member coverage need, or if there is, and again, when we look at that, we look at whether or not the needs of the members would be so cost prohibitive to add that coverage, or it would create competitive issues that, well, we will add the coverage, but now because we've added the coverage, our cost necessarily has to go up, and because of that, we're no longer competitive with others in the industry that or in the marketplace that don't provide that coverage. So those are considerations that staff and our board of directors consider when we're looking at making changes to the coverage agreement, particularly when we're looking at adding coverages or expanding limits on coverages. That's the first step. The next step, Alex, if you could advance, is we review the potential coverage changes with our reinsurers. The way that the pool works is on a financial basis. All of our claims that we have, the payment of claims and defense costs are paid out of the Ucip fund up to $250,000. So we pay the first $250,000 of each claim, and after that, we are a member of a reinsurance pool of other county pools throughout the United States that NACO created 25 years ago. So we're a pool member ourselves. And so we go to that entity and make sure that if we are considering adding coverages that our members are looking to and have a need for, that's one of our first stops, is to make sure that if we add the coverage, that the reinsurer doesn't have any exclusions and is comfortable with adding that coverage. And if they are going to make a charge for it, whether or not they would, what the cost would be, so that our board can consider whether or not the cost for the additional reinsurance to add the coverage, and that the passing that rate along to the membership is cost prohibitive or not to add the coverage. Again, because we are a member of that reinsurance pool and we're not buying traditional reinsurance, that group is much easier to work with. We like each of you has equity in Ucip and you are the owners of Ucip. We are the owners, part owner of our reinsurance group. So they're very open to our need to expand coverages and provide coverages. And very often, you know, some of the coverages that we'll talk about today that we've added actually was at the, you know, resulted from the reinsurer adding coverages for other county pool members for things that we hadn't yet thought about, but other county pools wanted to provide to their members. And so the reinsurer added it as a coverage to their coverage document. And so we passed that along and added it to our coverage document. So that's the next step in this process. And the next step is to review the draft changes with the Ucip Governance Committee. As you can imagine, for those of you who have reviewed the coverage addendum, it's, you know, it used to be about 170 pages long. So reviewing changes to that document can get pretty extensive. So our board of directors has identified a governance committee that anytime we're making changes to any of our governance documents, which is the interlocal agreement, the bylaws, and then the bylaws coverage addendum. Then anytime we're considering making changes to any of those documents, we first bring it to this governance committee who reviews the draft changes, provides feedback to staff, and prepares it to go to the next step in the process, which is review by the full Ucip board for their review and approval. So again, staff is not just making changes to the document. Based on our experience, it goes all the way through this process and doesn't go into effect until the board, full board has approved it by a majority vote. So that's the process that we use to make changes to the coverage document. The next thing I want to talk about is the new document structure. So for quite a while, for many years now, it's been staff's hope that we could make the coverage document, and we've worked on this over the years to try and make the coverage document an easier document for the members to go to and make use of and be able to read the document and understand it. I mean, obviously we are always available, myself, Corby, Sonia, and Marty, to assist you in determining whether or not a hypothetical question that you get from maybe your commissioners or department head, whether or not there is coverage for the thing that they're asking about. Again, if you want to just go to the coverage addendum and review it yourself, we want to make that as easy for you to do as possible. And so that was the main thrust of the reason for our rewrite of the document now. We had done a rewrite of the property form last year based on some updates and changes that our reinsurer had provided advice on. And staff thought it was time to finally bite the bullet and do a complete rewrite of the entire document. And so we got to work and did that. And I see the question in the chat, are all Ucip policies in Utah the same, or are there different ones for different counties, things that counties can opt in and out of? And the answer to that actually is no. First of all, there are no policies. Again, the document is an addendum to the bylaws of the entity. So we have the interlocal agreement that creates Ucip, and one of the things in that interlocal agreement is it allows and instructs the board of directors to create bylaws that identify how the organization will be run. And one of the things that's there in the interlocal and the bylaws also instructs the board to create a memorandum or a document that outlines for the membership when they can access funds of the pool and when they cannot access funds of the pool. And that is the bylaws coverage addendum. So there is just one addendum. It's the same for everyone. There are some very limited choices that you can make. One of the choices that comes to mind right away to me is that for the cyber liability coverage, some members have opted to buy higher limits than the standard limit that we provide. And so when we get to when you look in the coverage document, we have a listing in the coverage addendum of what the limits are for coverage for cyber liability. And we list each individual member and what the limit is for that member. And so that's where you'd identify whether or not your county has a higher limit for cyber liability than the standard $2 million coverage. There's one member that buys or takes advantage of a large deductible on property, but again, that's written in and is in the document that applies to all members. So all members would see that that particular county has that deductible for property and that all the deductibles for all the other members are the same. So the structure of the new document, and under the old document, we had a basic authority and scope area. Then we went into general conditions and exclusions, and then we went into the property part. We've restructured this again with the hope that it will make it easier for members to go to the coverage agreement and determine whether or not something's covered, how something is covered, what the payment on a loss would be, how that would be determined. And so the structure under the new document is that we first have just a couple of pages that I outline the authority, the scope, and the purpose of the document. And under the authority, again, it speaks of the fact that we are a interlocal entity operating under the Governmental Immunity Act authorization to have a liability reserve fund. And that's what Ucip is. It's a liability reserve fund. Again, it's not insurance, it's self-insurance by each of the counties jointly. And it also clarifies that nothing in the agreement, either the interlocal agreement or the coverage agreement, in any way waives or limits any of the immunities under the Governmental Immunity Act and those sorts of things. The scope just clarifies that we are providing all types of coverages, and the purpose again just outlines the reasons why the counties created and operate the pool. The next section that we go into are the terms, exclusions, and definitions that are applicable to all the coverage parts. This section is relatively short because, again, if there's a term or an exclusion, as an example, in this section, there are 4 exclusions. There are only 4 exclusions that apply to every single coverage part in the document. An example is any claim that's brought fraudulently is excluded. And that applies to every single coverage part. So that's where you're going to find that exclusion. And again, if a term is used throughout the coverage addendum and it's defined the same way all the way through the coverage addendum, then you'll find that definition for that term in the definitions applicable to all coverage parts. And as you go through the document, you'll find that bolded terms, if you see words that are bolded, that means that they are defined. And Sonia, jump in if I've got these backwards. And terms that are all in caps identify that that is a specific term that is either a coverage of some sort or an additional coverage. So it has a specific meaning, but it's not necessarily defined in the definitions. So it's easy to find those terms that you'd want to go to and say, oh, well, this is bolded, so I need to go to the definitions section to see what that word means. The next, we start then going into the actual separate coverage parts, and the first coverage part is the property coverage part that identifies all the coverage for the buildings, contents, equipment, and vehicle physical damage is also covered under the property coverage part. Next is the crime coverage part, which provides coverage for embezzlement by employees, theft, robbery. I'm trying to think of the term right now, but we've had some cases where employees have been tricked, or counties have been tricked into paying people online through different scams, and that voluntary parting, that's the term I was looking for, that voluntary parting of monies typically is not covered by insurance, but our crime coverage actually covers that as well. So there's, forgery, alteration of documents, those sorts of things are all covered under that crime coverage. Protects your money. The next section, we've moved the section. The cyber liability used to be an endorsement to the coverage addendum at the very end of the document. And we've actually made that now a separate coverage part, its own coverage part. And it's been renamed privacy or security event coverage, because that coverage now, when cyber liability first came out, one of my concerns with it was, okay, so you want us to buy insurance if we lose data electronically, but you've never been concerned about us losing data that's hard copy. And we've now expanded our cyber liability to include the loss of data, no matter how it happens. It does not have to happen electronically. If somebody comes in to the courthouse and starts going through the filing cabinets and making copies of private data that's protected under the privacy laws, that is still covered under the privacy or security event coverage part. The next section now, and we place the privacy or security coverage there between the property coverages, which property and crime coverage are, think of it in terms of first party coverage. When we pay a claim under those two coverages, the payment's going to go to the county because it's the county that was harmed. Now we're shifting over into the liability section, where when we make a payment, that payment's going to go to a third party who sues you. Privacy or security event coverage we've got in between the two, because the privacy and security event coverage, as we'll see when we review the new coverages, provides both coverages that we would make payments to the county for losses that you sustained, as well as liability coverages if someone sues you because you lost their data. So the first part, as we get into the liability coverage parts, is the terms, exclusions, definitions that are applicable to all the liability coverage parts. So just like we had terms, exclusions, and definitions that apply to all coverage parts, now these terms, exclusions, and definitions apply just to the liability coverage parts, which include the auto liability coverage part, the general liability coverage part, the new law enforcement liability coverage part, the public officials liability coverage part, and the employee benefits liability coverage part. So again, if you are looking, say you're looking now to see if there's coverage, a certain type of coverage, something is covered under the new law enforcement liability coverage part, you'd go to that coverage part, you'd read through the coverage part to look to see what you can find out about the coverage you're looking for. If you see bolded terms, you'd go to the definitions that apply to the law enforcement coverage part. Then you'd go to if you don't find it there, you'd go to the definitions that apply to all liability coverage parts. And if you don't find it there, you'd go to the definitions that apply to all coverage parts. And somewhere in one of those definition sections, you will find the definition to the term you're looking for. Likewise with exclusions. You'd look first, each one of these sections. Alex, if you want to go to the next slide. Each coverage part has its own definitions and exclusions, as you see here. It also, each coverage part starts out with a section called coverage provided. So that's just a general description of the coverage that coverage part provides. Then it has a section for terms of the coverage that includes the limits of the coverage that's provided. So that's where you'll find what the limits provided are. And then the next section in each coverage part would be the exclusions that apply to that particular coverage part, in addition to the exclusions in the exclusions that apply to all liability coverage parts and the exclusions that apply to all coverage parts. And then lastly, in each coverage part, you'll find a definition section for definitions of terms that are used only in that coverage part. Or it might be a term. We tried not to use the same term defined differently in one section or another. But if that is the case, that there's a word that's defined differently in different coverage parts, then you'd use the definition in the coverage part that you find it for that definition. So next, we'll start looking at some of the changes to coverage terms and limits. And we'll start with the property. So some of these changes took place last July 1st. Others of them were amended in March or February when the board approved these changes, and those changes became effective March 1st. The first one is the total per occurrence limit so any one occurrence, the total limit that Ucip would pay out for all damage and all counties combined went from $500 million to $750 million. So it was increased $250 million. And again, that was available to us because our reinsurer was able to negotiate those higher limits with their reinsurers in London and Bermuda and those places where they buy their reinsurance. Because they when we pay the first $250, our reinsurer, for most claims, they pay the next $3 million up to, or excuse me, they pay the next layer up to $5 million. And then anything over $5 million, they buy reinsurance from the standard market for themselves. So that's the first change to the property. The next, Alex, is we have had, for the last couple of years, coverage for evacuation of patients that is precipitated due to covered damage to a building. And we've expanded that to also include evacuation of inmates. So if you have a fire at the jail that requires you to evacuate the inmates, now you have used to have $1 million. Now we have $2.5 million available for the cost of hiring buses and doing that sort of thing to evacuate the inmates to another location, and then also to transport them back to the jail once the changes have been or the building's been repaired and it's ready to get the inmates back. I'll just clarify that this is for the evacuation itself. It does not cover the costs of you housing those inmates somewhere else, but it does cover the cost of you actually moving them and transporting them to and from the damaged building. The next new coverage or change that we made, we've had insect, animal, and vermin damage coverage to vehicles, but for some reason it was just for vehicles and not for mobile equipment like your graders, and other four-wheelers and things of that sort. And we've had some claims, and so we've expanded that so that if you have an animal make their nest in the engine of your grader over the winter and there's significant damage to belts and hoses and things of that sort, that is now covered under the property coverage. Next, we've got land and water contamination or pollutant removal was added, and that new coverage is provided. The limits are $2.5 million per occurrence and a $5 million per annual coverage year, which is the calendar year for land and water contaminant and pollutant removal. So, you know, pollution coverage is getting more and more difficult to get in the marketplace, but we were able to add that again because our reinsurer was able to provide it. If that is a coverage that you are interested in, then certainly you'll want to review that section that talks about that new land and water contaminant or pollutant removal. The next item is the coverage territory was expanded to include Canada. Now that probably doesn't mean a lot to you. When you first think about, well, we don't own any property in Canada, but for some of you who have equipment that needs to be sent out and for maintenance, or it needs to be shipped out to be repaired, or it's you've already purchased it and it's being shipped to you. In any of those situations, if it's in Canada when it's damaged and you've already taken ownership of it, that now would be covered. Next item is we've had coverage that if your employee is using their vehicle for county business, typically in a standard auto policy, business auto policy, there's no coverage at all for damage to the vehicles that are owned by your employees. But we have always provided reimbursement up to $500 for the employee's deductible that they might have on that vehicle. So we did two things here. First of all, we removed the requirement of them having to have insurance with a deductible. So if they have a $400 four-wheeler that they were driving as a volunteer to the search and rescue, and because it was only worth $400, they didn't buy physical damage insurance for it, and now it's totaled out, we'd pay them $400, the actual cash value of that vehicle. And again, we've expanded it not only that it doesn't have to be a deductible, but it includes mobile equipment as well as vehicles. And next is we did put an exclusion based on an exclusion that the reinsurer was forced to provide. So equipment that supplies fuel or refrigeration, this one is actually an improvement. We'll get to the one I was starting to talk about in just a minute. But actually, now equipment that's supplying fuel or refrigeration has been added to the equipment breakdown coverage, and that wasn't specifically shown there in the past. So that's some new coverage. Next is we've got some new unscheduled limits that are made available. So tunnels, bridges, airport runways, and dams that for some reason you forgot to put on the schedule that are covered. That limit for those unscheduled tunnels, bridges, airport runways, and dams increased from $250,000 to $2.5 million. Now understand, when we talk about tunnels and bridges here, we are talking about for the most part, pedestrian tunnels and bridges, not roadways or highways. Those are excluded from coverage. But if you have pedestrian tunnels and bridges, maybe like at the Davis County Golf courses, they have bridges, pedestrian bridges that the carts ride over and things. Those are covered up to $2.5 million, even if Charlene forgot to schedule it. Unmanned aircraft systems or drones, the coverage for physical damage to those went from $100,000 per system, or excuse me, it was increased to $100,000 per system and $1 million per occurrence, even if you haven't scheduled it. So again, if you forgot to tell us, and again, with these unscheduled limits, the idea is that you don't have to schedule them anymore. It's if you forgot to schedule it, no one told you that they bought a drone, which I know does happen from time to time for you guys, that we're still going to provide the coverage for it. So those are the unscheduled limits. And next, Alex, we also added unscheduled watercraft that was increased. The limit was $1.5 million. Now it's up to $2.5 million if you have a lot of watercraft. Wharves, docks, piers, pilings, and bulkheads went from $1 million to $2.5 million. So again, if you've got some docks that the county has at parks and things like that, that you forgot to put on the schedule, you still got coverage available. And next is some of the definitions in the property that actually provide more coverage. The fine arts definition was expanded to include murals and mounted animals and mounted insects. This one, murals was added by our reinsurer, but the mounted animals and insects actually came out of a request that we made to our reinsurer, because we cover the Dixie Center, event center down in Washington County, and they, for those of you who have ever gone through there, they have one of the world's best mounted animal displays there in their museum at the Dixie Center. Significant values of mounted animals there. So we wanted to make sure that there was no question that those mounted animals, and they've also got some insects that are mounted for display there, are covered as a fine art. So we've added that coverage. Next is we've defined replacement cost, actual cash value, and reproduction cost very clearly in the definitions to make sure that everyone understands the difference between those two valuations when we go to pay a claim. Next is the earthquake coverage was actually changed to earth movement coverage, which earth movement is much broader than earthquake. So it broadened the coverage that's available to earth movement situations. Next, we've got some exclusion clarifications. And again, these are more clarifications. These are things that were always meant to be excluded. We just clarified it and made it very clear in the document what it is that is excluded. And like I mentioned earlier, we've got the exclusion to roads, streets, and highways. And that exclusion includes road signs and guardrails that are part of that roadway, street, or highway. And not a real change in coverage, because members have, we've not covered them, and members have never scheduled road signs, guardrails, those sorts of things. And you can imagine what your contribution bill would be if we had you schedule the cost to replace every road sign, and every guardrail in the county. It's just cost prohibitive to provide coverage for that. The next change to the exclusions, equipment to produce power or gas for distribution to others was added to our coverage agreement. Again, this was one that the reinsurers of our reinsured required. They wanted to make sure that we really were a county pool and not a municipal pool. Again, lots of cities have power distribution plants, gas distribution plants, and things like that. But as based on what you've reported to us, none of the counties own such equipment. So that, again, this is a an exclusion that really doesn't affect members because you don't have that type of equipment that would be excluded. And we have clarified that that does not include your diesel generator that you have sitting outside to pop on when you lose power. The next item is that for vandalism, at a vacant location, when we define vacant location, that exclusion clarifies that at a vacant property, there's no vandalism coverage, no coverage for sprinkler leakage, glass breakage, or theft. And any other coverage that's provided at a vacant property, you have a 15% deductible on that coverage. So we would just pay 85% of the damages for fire, flood, any of those things. And again, based on the definition of vacant property, it appears that none of the members have a property that would be considered vacant, given the time period it needs to be vacant, the percentage of the building that needs to be vacant, and those sorts of things. If you have buildings that you're concerned might fall under that definition of vacant, give me a call and we'll review it and make sure whether or not it does fall under that definition. Next, fiber optic cables was added to the exceptions for things that we cover that are underground property. And many of you have had fiber optic cables buried under your buildings that have not been covered, but after quite a bit of work with our reinsurers and their work with their reinsurers, we've finally been able to add that coverage. So those fiber optic cables under the ground are now covered. And next, another clarification that arose through COVID, the business interruption coverage that's provided, so that, and the business interruption coverage works that if there is covered damage to your building to the extent that you cannot continue your business in that building, the cost of interruption of your business is covered. And we, like every other insurer in the country, clarified that business interruption, that first of all, again, the business interruption has to be due to physical damage to the building, and that business interruption that arises out of a communicable disease is not covered under that business interruption. So again, really no impact, it's just clarification so that it's very clear. So if you are need to explain to another business that you work with, the state or the feds that are asking you, do you have coverage for this? It's very clear now what is and is not covered. And next is one of the big things that I was real excited about that our reinsurer was implemented and we implemented as well, is the new for two vehicles coverage. So any of your owned vehicles or owned mobile equipment that are totaled, so we're going to pay for a new vehicle because it was completely, it's not salvageable. If it's less than 2 model years old, we will replace it with the new model year vehicle. So if you have a 2019 vehicle that you own that burns to a crisp today, we will buy you a 2021 vehicle. So great coverage. I think that'll be real helpful for a lot of our members. And again, that is on owned vehicles, not leased vehicles. The next, we get into the privacy or security event coverage. With the privacy or security event coverage, there used to be sublimits. There was a sublimit for the expenses related to privacy or security. So if you wanted to put in place credit monitoring services for employees that you thought that maybe their data was stolen, that was an expense, but there was a sublimit of how much you could spend on those types of expenses. Similarly, there was a limit on the coverage for regulatory or defense for regulatory proceedings and the fines that might come from a regulating agency. There are no sublimits there anymore. So you've got the full $2 million limit to spend in any one of those categories the way you want to, whether you want to spend it on expenses, if you've got regulatory fines and fees, and whether or not you want to save it in case you do get sued by people for loss of their data later on. So again, that's what you want to be careful of, is you don't want to spend the full $2 million on claims expenses and then you get a lawsuit because you've got no coverage left if you do that. So, and also under the privacy or security, we added a new coverage for network interruption cost coverage, and also new coverage for damage to electronic equipment and data. Those are two new coverages under the privacy or security event coverage, and there's a $250,000 per occurrence limit for those two new coverages. And next, we also added $50,000 of extortion coverage. So if you're one of the unfortunate entities, like we've had a few, that somebody in Russia encrypts all the data on your computer systems and server, and tells you that you've got to pay them $30,000 in order to have them unencrypt your data so you can go back to work, we will pay up to $50,000 of that actual amount that you're paying the extortionist for on that claim. So another new coverage that we've had members that have gotten in that situation, so it's great to add that coverage. And then also the privacy and security event, just like everything, there was a communicable disease exclusion added. How someone gets a communicable disease because their privacy information was stolen, I'm not sure, but we wear belts and suspenders here and make sure we cover all our bases. And next, we have the liability highlights to wrap this up. And we've got some modified language regarding the defense for districts that don't have a county attorney. As you know, our coverage for defense, we don't owe the defense directly to the county or directly to an individual employee. What we do is, because county attorneys are required by law to defend all claims against the county, our coverage provides to pay for assistance counsel to the county attorney to defend those claims. So when our attorneys are working defending your claim, they are actually working for the county attorney. Some of the county attorney's offices actually deputize our attorneys for that particular claim or claims that they are handling for the county, to clarify that they are a deputy county attorney as they're defending that claim. But again, districts, special districts, we've got about 40 of them now, I think, aren't covered necessarily by county attorneys. So we modified the language there for those of you who are a health district or special district, to clarify how we provide that defense coverage. And next is we updated the we've always had, or well, not always, but since AIDS, we've had an HIV exclusion in the liability coverage part, and that's now been excluded or expanded to cover all communicable disease exclusions. And while I was really concerned about adding an exclusion to particularly COVID, a communicable disease exclusion that would include COVID-19, the way this exclusion reads, I believe there's still going to be coverage if one of the health departments is sued for the actions they took to restrict things and that sort of thing. It really speaks more towards that there's no coverage if people are making claims that they got COVID because of your actions. But lawsuits because you recommended wearing masks or things like that, based on my reading of the definition, I think that's still covered. The next change that we made in the liability, we removed the exclusion to incidental malpractice in the endorsement section and moved it right into the GL coverage. And that's something that we did throughout the document. We had 30 or so endorsements or amendments to the coverage document at the very end of the document, just like an insurance policy has a whole bunch of endorsements at the end. So once you've read the whole policy, then you have to go through the endorsements. And what those endorsements usually did is said, we completely delete the exclusion in the GL to incidental malpractice and replace it with this language. And so we went through the entire document, moved all but just a couple of the endorsements right into the coverage part. So you no longer have a bunch of endorsements at the end of the document, which is, again, makes it a lot easier to determine whether there's coverage or not. The next change was we removed the exclusion to land subsidence. Here in Utah, that's a big one. When the side of one of the hills lets loose and a bunch of homes are all of a sudden at the bottom of the hill instead of the top of the hill, and you get sued because you approved that subdivision, that exclusion to liability claims arising out of land subsidences, it has been removed, and so you now have coverage for that. Next is personal injury definition was split between the different coverage parts. Personal injury covers, the GL covers bodily injury and property damage. Public officials more or less covers civil rights coverage. Law enforcement covers both bodily injury and civil rights type things. And the civil rights, trademark infringement, copyright infringement, libel, slander, all those sorts of things are part of the personal injury that is provided in insurance policies. And we've taken that personal injury, and rather than having a full coverage part for personal injury, a portion of it is provided under the GL, a portion is provided under the public officials, a portion is provided under the law enforcement liability, and a portion is covered under the employee benefits liability. So again, it's very clear to see what parts of that personal injury coverage is provided in the appropriate coverage section or coverage part. And next, we have an entirely new law enforcement liability coverage part. First of all, we, as many of you know, just a couple years ago, we created a new rate and split the rate for general liability and public officials liability claims, where the majority of law enforcement claims were going to general liability and covered under the general liability. And we split the rate so that we actually lowered the general liability rate and created a new rate for law enforcement liability. And so with that new rate, we just want to make sure that when claims come in, the claim goes to the correct coverage part. And if it's a law enforcement claim, that it goes to the law enforcement coverage part. So we created that new law enforcement coverage part. Again, I'm happy to review that with any of you that have questions on that. And as we also, when we added that new coverage part through negotiations with the reinsurer, we used to have for just the last several years, we had an annual aggregate on the excess portion of these claims for law enforcement, and we were able to remove that. So now, where in the past you had $3 million available for every single law enforcement and GL claim, and then if the claim was more than $3 million and you needed to use the $5 million limit, that extra $2 million we tap into. But after we had tapped into that enough times to add up to $10 million excess of 3, that excess coverage was gone. And that now you get $5 million every time for every law enforcement liability claim with no aggregate, either annual aggregate or any other type of aggregate. And next is the terrorism sublimit was completely removed now and moved from the endorsements to the coverage part. So now you have the full limit of coverage for all terrorism claims. And that actually is the last of our highlights with the liability and the last of the highlights on the changes to the coverage document. So I ran a little long. Are there any questions? Don't see any in the chat. I don't see any hands raised. So again, if you have questions on the new format or the new coverages, please don't hesitate to give me a call or send me an email, and I'd be happy to give you more information on those coverages and how to go through and read the coverage addendum. So thanks.